In this video, we will be replacing the Evap Core expansion valve and heater core in this 2003 Toyota Camry. With the refrigerant evacuated out of the system, we are able to begin work on replacing the evaporator core through the passenger side door. We can gain access to the area that we will be working on, which is located behind the glove box in the dash. We can begin by opening the glove box. On the side of the glove box, there is a small shock absorber to remove. And we can depress both sides of the glove box so that will drop down. We next want to remove our outer trim surrounding our glove box location. Towards the top, we have 3 Phillips head screws. We can then work the top end of that down just a little bit. Underneath the glove box location, we have a black cover plate, and we can depress 3 small tabs to remove this black cover. And we can then wiggle that out. On the left side, towards the bottom, we have a small trim piece that will reveal a Phillips head screw. Located in the bottom right corner, we have a trim panel that needs to be removed as well. And this is held on by a thumb screw towards the back. And a couple clips. And that will give us access to a 10mm bolt. And then our trim piece can be removed. We then have a small piece of ducting that needs to be removed. This is held on by 1 pin. And we can slide that ducting out. The blower housing unit is the next item to remove. We have a variety of wiring harnesses connecting around the perimeter of the blower housing. We can just work our way around, disconnecting one at a time. 3 on the left. 3 down below. We have a couple clips holding a bunch of wires. And a couple other clips. So at this point, we are basically following the perimeter of the blower housing. And we want to locate the bolts that are mounting it onto the vehicle. The first one is located towards the top left corner of the blower housing. This is a 10mm bolt. Our next 10mm bolt is located towards the bottom left portion of the blower housing. Next, if we take a look towards the bottom center, we can see a couple what look like nuts or washers. And these use an 8mm wrench or socket to get those off. And we have one additional one of those weird 8mm nut washer things located right in the center, straight up on top of the blower unit. This is the most difficult one to get to and took a bit of time to get out. At this point, we have removed our 2 10mm bolts and our 2 weird washer bolt things. We should be able to slide this unit towards the right and wiggle it out. and there will quite possibly be some additional wires we need to remove. And we are getting caught up on our wiring harness bracket, so we will remove that. And an additional wiring harness up here. Getting hung up on the carpet in the back. And one additional wiring harness is holding us up. With that blower housing unit removed, we want to focus our attention towards the back left corner underneath the dash. We have two lines coming in, leading to a big glob of black tape. If we peel all of that insulation tape off, we will get access to the expansion valve. This is one of the components that we will be replacing. And at this point, we're going to shift our focus to the driver's side portion of the vehicle. With the passenger side stripped down to the expansion valve, we can focus on the driver's side. With the driver's side door open, we want to identify our front door scuff plate. We can use a screwdriver or trim removal tool to remove that front door scuff plate. If you are using a screwdriver, you may want to tape the end of the screwdriver so that you do not scratch any of the paint. Next, we want to identify the cowl side trim. We will be pulling the cowl side trim rearward to remove it. And taking a look underneath, we can see that we have a thumb screw that needs to be removed. And then we can work that off. We then want to identify our front pillar garnish, and again, using a taped screwdriver or trim removal tool, we can work that front pillar garnish piece off. We then want to identify our steering wheel pad, and we want to make sure that the wheels are facing straight ahead. And we're going to be looking on the side of the steering wheel. We can see a small plastic cover on the right side and a small plastic cover on the left side. And using a small screwdriver, we can remove both of these cover pieces. And taking a look inside that cover piece, we have a T30 Torx head screw. And these bolts will loosen up, but they will not come out all the way. Next, we can work the steering wheel pad off and disconnect the airbag wiring harness. And don't forget the ground. And when storing the airbag, always make sure it is in the upright position. In the center of the steering wheel, we have a set nut. This needs to come out next. And this is a 19mm nut. With a marker, I can create some match marks to help line this back up. And using a steering wheel remover, we can remove the steering wheel. And we do have a wiring harness we will try to work around. With that steering wheel removed, we do see our clock spring, and it is worth noting that this says top and it is pointing up. On our steering wheel assembly, we have an upper column cover and we have a lower column cover. And with a Phillips head screwdriver, we can remove the two visible screws. And using a trim removal tool, we can work off the bottom half. And then we can tilt the wheel down and remove the upper column cover. And as I go along, I am going to be cleaning off the interior components just because they've never been cleaned. Next, we will be identifying the number 1 lower instrument panel, and we need to locate the 2 bolts holding this number 1 lower instrument panel in place. Our first bolt on the bottom left is a 10mm bolt. And on the bottom right, we have a small trim piece to remove, giving us access to a Phillips head screw. And we also need to disconnect our hood release latch from underneath. With the right side loose, we can remove our little storage tray. And in that little storage tray location, we have 1 Phillips head screw. And on the back of that number 1 lower instrument panel, we do have a wiring harness. This goes to our switch that dims the instrument cluster. We can depress that tab and wiggle that free. At this point, we want to remove our left-hand lower instrument panel. This is held on by 4 bolts, and these are all 10mm bolts. We do have our wiring harness down below. This wiring harness is for our OBD2 port. In the center of our steering wheel area, we have a spiral cable. This is also called a clock spring. We have 3 tabs on the back side. And using a flathead screwdriver, we can gently work that loose, releasing those clips. Now we are still held on by a couple wiring harnesses. This first one is spring loaded, so we need to keep that in mind as we try to remove that. And the second one we can just pop off. Taking a look back at our steering wheel location, we have 2 combination switches. These combination switches also have release tabs that we need to depress to remove them. And that then has a wiring harness we can work off. And another wiring harness. If I take a look where my steering wheel was connected to, and I follow that shaft down into the vehicle, I will come to my intermediate shaft assembly. This assembly has 1 bolt. That 1 bolt is connecting my steering column assembly to my intermediate shaft assembly. Taking a look underneath the dash, I can see my 1 bolt or at least the end of it with the threads. And then up top, I can see the head of that bolt. This is the bolt that I want to remove, but before I remove it, I want to put some match marks at the connection point between my intermediate shaft assembly and my steering column. And this then will be loosened with a 12mm combination wrench from the top. Taking a look back to the area where our steering wheel goes, we're going to be looking back underneath behind this, and we are basically following this down about halfway and then looking way up underneath. And underneath there we can see 2 bolts that we need to remove. And if we follow that steering column back and take a look inside there, when we move this, there is a pivot point. This is a 3rd bolt that we need to remove. At this point, we have quite a few wiring harnesses held on by little plastic tabs. So we're just going to work our way down the steering column and release some of these to hopefully let that steering column go free. A couple wiring harnesses here. Wiring harness up by our ignition. Another one up top. So at this point, I have worked off all of the wiring harnesses off of the steering column. I do have 1 wiring harness left on the ignition. And the only way to get this one out is to put the key in and turn it to the accessories. This will allow us to release that wiring harness. And we can then remove that steering column. And at this point, we are going to shift our focus from the driver's side to the passenger side. On our passenger side, we have already removed everything down, including to our blower assembly. This allowed us access to the expansion valve. Taking a look up underneath the passenger side, this is the bottom side of the dash. We can see our reinforcement bracket. This is the tube of steel running across the entire length. We also see our airbag module behind it. And we have a wiring harness on both sides of that airbag module. We want to work that wiring harness off of the airbag module. We then have 1 12mm bolt holding that airbag module in. Taking a look at our dash area, we're going to next remove the lowermost trim panel below the heater control knobs. There is 1 Phillips head screw on each side of this lower trim piece. Now this should be a fairly simple removal piece. The problem is this trim is sitting behind other trim components. So as we remove this, We also then need to remove a bunch of other trim components off of the console to slowly give access to this original piece we are trying to remove. Additionally, what we will eventually run into is the shifter is in the way of removing these, so we can continue to take off pieces, but inevitably that shifter will get in the way and we'll have to work around that. On our console, we have 2 Phillips head screws and 2 10mm bolts that we need to remove next. So at this point, what I am figuring out is that the shifter is in the way of removing these various trim pieces, which means that we need to shift this out of park so that we can remove these trim pieces and then we can shift it back into park. So we do need to connect our harness for power. We also need to insert the key so that we can install our harness for the ignition. We can then shift out of park and remove this trim piece. Got a wiring harness on the back here. And then we can remove the wiring harnesses and remove the steering column and get back to work. And then we can work the cigarette lighter wiring harness off. And then I can work off those additional trim components. And with that console area trim removed, we can see our housing that we were trying to get to. The next item to remove on our list is the temperature control panel. Using a trim tool, we can work that off. And there are 2 wiring harnesses on this. And with that removed, we have 2 10mm bolts next. We can then work off the trim pieces that are surrounding our radio. There is a wiring harness up at the top which connects to the clock. And then we have an additional 2 10mm bolts holding that radio in. And a couple connection points on the back of that. We have a trim piece located below our instrument panel. This will expose 2 Phillips head screws. With those screws removed, we can work our instrument cluster off. As we tip it forward, we will see a couple wiring harnesses, and we can work those wiring harnesses off. Our objective at this point is to remove the dash. We need to follow the contour of the dash looking for bolts holding it in. We have a 10mm nut in the location behind where our instrument panel was. We have a 10mm bolt located underneath where our heater control valves were. Another 10mm bolt located to the right of where our glove box was. To the right of the location of our glove box, we have another 10mm bolt. And at this point, our driver's side is mostly free. And looking back underneath the dash behind the glove box area, we have an additional 10mm nut. And I'm caught just a little bit on my trim, so we'll remove this piece as well. Now we are still connected by our speakers. We do have a wiring harness connection that we can work through from the front side. And we also have the wiring harness for the glove box switch. And then we should be able to work that out. Our objective is to remove the AC unit. That is located in the central portion towards the rear. So we've been taking all this stuff off just to get to this point. We have a piece of structure that runs the width of the vehicle. We need to start working that off next and pivoting that forward so that we can pull this AC unit out. My goal is to begin on the passenger side furthest to the door, move the length of the piece of structure, and only remove the minimum possible to get this pivoting forward just enough to get that AC unit out. So we'll begin with a couple 12mm bolts. On my driver's side, I have a 10mm bolt located directly behind where the steering wheel would be. And then all the way over to my driver's side near the door, I have 3 studs that I see. And on the outside of my door, I have plugs. And with those plugs removed, we can see our 3 bolts that go into the inside of the vehicle and connect to that structural piece. And to the right of the radio, another bracket. This one is a 10mm. And back over to the driver's side, we have another one underneath. On my passenger side, I'm going to work my bracket around the existing structure. At this point, I have a fair amount of mobility with this structural component. It is possible, and what I'm hoping is I can pull this out far enough without needing to disconnect too much more, and then slip that AC unit out. If I remove the floor mat and peel back the carpet, this will give me a better indication of how the AC unit is held in on the passenger side. A dime! Now the evap coil is located behind the expansion valve. So I know that this entire unit needs to come out, and then the unit needs to be disassembled outside of the vehicle. And towards the bottom I can see 1 and 2 connection points that I'm going to start with. We have a 10mm and an 8mm. And I'm also going to disconnect my expansion valve while I'm working on this side. And as of right now, everything is pretty loose on the passenger side. We'll shift our focus to the driver's side next. And again, removing the floor mat and pulling that carpet back to begin will give us better access. And we'll start with removing 1 10mm bolt just on the opposite side of the passenger. And directly above that one, we have another 10mm bolt on a bracket. And then I have my 2 heater core lines. Now if I were to disconnect these lines, I would have coolant coming out into the vehicle. So instead we will begin by disconnecting them inside the engine bay. We need to find the location, which is right on the other side of where the driver sits. Now it is probably not absolutely necessary to remove all of this. I am doing it more so for the purpose of filming so that I can get the camera in there to show you what I'm doing. And with that air intake assembly out of the way, we have a little clearer access to see those 2 heater lines running into the firewall. I'm going to disconnect both of these and position them higher than the rest of the system. This should prevent most of the coolant loss. And with a shop vac, I'm going to attempt to vacuum out the residual fluid. Now for this repair, I am replacing the heater core. So what I will be doing in this step is removing the heater lines from the core. This does involve disconnecting the line from the core, which compromises the integrity of this fitting. Once this has been compromised, you basically can't get it back together and sealed. But again, because I am replacing the heater core, it doesn't really matter at this point. The purpose of me doing this was hopefully to aid in the removal process of the HVAC unit, just to have one less thing to deal with and get caught on other parts. Now, again, if you are keeping the existing heater core, do not do this. Taking a look at the center console area, I have 2 air ducts, one on the left, one on the right, all the way down towards the bottom. These will need to be spread apart to lift this AC unit out. And on the driver's side, I have some ductwork as well that will need to be disconnected. Now if I take a look back at my heater core lines, where they come in through the firewall, I have a retaining clip holding those in place. That clip is connected to this AC unit, so I need to work that off. And I can actually slip those lines through so they're out of the way. And on the top portion of our AC unit, we have our defrost ductwork. There are 4 tabs, 2 on the front, 2 on the back, holding this in place so we can work those off. And that then reveals an 8mm fastener right in the center. Looks like we have a couple wiring harness connections on the left side. And it looks like we will need to bring our structural member forward, which means we'll need to disconnect a few wiring harnesses where there's not enough slack on the right side. On my left side, I can disconnect that wiring harness. And I have a little retainer that I can work off. Give me some flexibility there. Taking a look right in front, I have a couple wiring harnesses with clips. Release those to give me a little more flexibility. And I have another harness held on. To the front of that. That's all looking pretty good. And on my structural piece, anywhere that there is a wiring harness that is too tight, I'm going to loosen that up. So I got one right here. I got two in the back. There we go. And that might be enough to get me access. And at this point we have successfully removed our AC unit. Now I do want to bring up one thought. If we rotate it to the side that had our expansion valve, we have our expansion valve location on the outside of the evap coil. We have our ductwork port that's clearly viewable, and inside there we can clearly see our evap coil. Wouldn't it have been much easier for the manufacturer to put an access door on this side of the AC unit so you could just open the door and slide the evap coil out? Just a thought. I know there are some hacks where you can cut this, but then getting it resealed and back together would prove to be problematic. So going back to our whole unit, we have a series of screws that run the entire perimeter of this unit. We're going to work our way around, unscrewing all of these screws. We can then separate that housing to gain access to the evap coil. And we can pull that evap coil out with the tray. And we can remove our drip tray. And we do have a piece of insulation running around 3 sides of our coil. And I always like to compare my new part with my old part. My new part did come with a piece of insulation. And this insulation is not long enough to cover 3 sides as the old one. So I'm going to add just a little bit of additional insulation just so it matches the old one. Because we are replacing the evaporator, we need to add 1.4 fluid ounces of ND oil 8 or the equivalent. I'm using a PAG 46 refrigerant oil. This 1.4 fluid ounces needs to be added to the evaporator before we reassemble this back together. On our new unit, we have 2 4mm Allen head screws, and this unit is pressurized, so be aware. And then a couple plugs. And with all of that oil installed, we can then add our insulator and tray and slide that back into position. And then I'm going to add my plugs and my cap, and this will prevent that oil from leaking out when I am moving this around trying to get it back in the vehicle. I can then work my 2 halves back together on this assembly, making sure everything lines up just right. And when we get all of the dampers lined up, there are 4 of them in there that should seal nice and tight, and we can add our screws. And this unit is then ready to get reinstalled into the vehicle. We'll begin the reassembly process by reinstalling our AC unit. We do need to work it around the various clumps of wires. And with my AC unit slightly in place, I have my heater core so that it is facing upwards. And we will replace this with our new heater core. We can then work our new heater core in place. And we do want to be very careful with those heater core lines and very gently work that AC unit back into position. And I'll add that top 8mm nut to make sure that things don't move around. And since I do have a little bit of access, I'll go ahead and install my retainer for my heater lines, as well as my retainer for the heater core itself. I can then move my structural piece back forward and reconnect those wire ties. I have a grouping of wires that gets attached to the front of the AC unit, and 2 additional clips on the upper portion, and a wiring harness on the left side of the AC unit, and a little retainer as well. Then we have our defrost ductwork with our 4 retaining clips. Inside the engine bay, we can reconnect our coolant hoses, as well as any other components that you might have removed. And I'm going to add a little bit of coolant and manually work that through the lines a little bit. This will help allow me to see if those fittings sealed on the heater core. And after having topped off the coolant in the engine bay, we want to check the heater core to make sure that there are no leaks on our heater hose fittings. On our driver's side to the left of our unit, we have our ductwork we need to install, and I'll add this little carpet Velcro strip that I removed. And directly below that, if I move that structural piece a little bit, I need to line up my hole for my 10mm bolt. This may require adjusting that structural member just slightly so we can get that lined up. And then we can add that in. My driver's side ductwork can then be reattached, followed by the driver's side carpet. At this point, I'm going to pull the expansion valve and lines. Now, these lines have previously been disconnected as this repair is part of a much greater repair. I have disconnected these inside the engine bay, which allows me to pull these out through the firewall. And if you haven't yet replaced the expansion valve, now would be a good time to do that. On my passenger side, this is the right portion of our AC unit. We have another 8mm nut. And our passenger side, we also have a drain hose that we need to make sure is installed properly. And then another 10mm bolt. This one holding on our right ducting. And then we can replace that passenger side carpet. Our driver side has a 12mm bolt underneath. On the passenger side, I have a 10mm bolt holding my bracket to the structural component. I then have the 3 bolts on my driver's side. And I'm going to start these by hand before I tighten them down. Followed by our caps. And on my driver's side, another 12mm bolt and 2 more 12mm bolts for the passenger side bracket. And at this point, I can work the dash back into place. And there will be a bracket down on the right that might get in the way. Now before I remove the dash, I did take a couple pictures of the wiring harnesses, where they were located at and where they were coming through. I'm going to attempt to recreate that positioning as best as I can at this point. We can reconnect the wiring harness for our glove box switch. We have a retainer for our wiring bundle under the radio. We have our passenger side speaker and our driver side speaker. Our upper passenger trim comes next. On the middle of the passenger side, we have a 10mm nut holding the dash to the structure. And we have a 10mm bolt on the passenger side with a plug. On the lower right passenger side, we have another 10mm bolt. On the driver's side, we have a 10mm bolt near the heater control knobs. We also have a 10mm nut by the instrument panel. Next comes the instrument cluster. We have 2 wiring harnesses on the back, and this is held in with 2 screws. And a little trim piece will finish that up. Our radio then has 3 connection points and 4 bolts. And our radio trim has 1 wiring harness for the clock. And our heater control unit has 2 wiring harnesses. And we will continue by installing some of our trim pieces around the center console, working those into place and lining up any locations where fasteners go. We have a wiring harness for our power outlet. And then to shift this out of park, we need to temporarily hook up the steering column so we can move that out of the way and fit that last trim component in there. There are 2 nuts and 2 Phillips head screws. And we have 2 Phillips head screws holding that trim piece on. And back underneath our passenger side, we can see our airbag module. We have 1 12mm bolt. And I do have 2 harnesses, 1 on each side. Our steering column wiring harnesses were previously installed when we had to shift to get that trim piece on. So I can position the steering column in place and start my longest bolt. My next goal is to align my match marks on my steering column with the rest of the steering system. So with my steering column secured and my match marks lined up, I have tightened my bolt to make sure that everything is solid. And then any additional wiring harness clips can be reinstalled on the steering column. And 2 additional 12mm bolts for the steering column. We can install our controls and the 2 wiring harnesses, followed by the clock spring, and then 2 wiring harnesses. And we have our metal panel. We can feed through our OBD2 harness and install 4 10mm bolts. For our lower trim panel, we have a wiring harness connected to our dimmer switch for the instrument cluster. And then we can slide that component in place. We want to leave it loose at the bottom a little bit because we still need to attach our hood release latch. And 1 Phillips head screw We'll hold that in place. And then we have that tray to install. And then we want to reconnect our hood latch. And 2 additional trim screws. One is a Phillips head, the other is a 10 millimeter. After that comes our upper and lower steering wheel trim. And we want those to lock into each other, and 2 Phillips head screws. We can work our wiring harnesses through that steering wheel. Then we want to line up our match marks. And tighten that nut. On the steering wheel, we can plug in our wiring harness to that clock spring. We'll prep these harnesses by pulling out the retaining clip. And 2 T30 Torx screws on either side, and our cover piece. Then we have our lower left trim held on by that 1 thumb screw. And we're going to be putting our last trim piece on for the driver's side before we switch back over to our passenger side and finish that up. With a 4 millimeter Allen head wrench, we can remove our cover piece for our evap coil. This does have new rubber rings on it. However, we are going to apply a little bit of additional oil to these rings before we slip on the expansion valve. And this connection will be torqued to 48 inch-pounds. And then we can add a little insulation. We can then work our blower in place. And then we have 4 fasteners. The one on the top and one on the bottom is an 8 millimeter, and 2 additional ones on the left are 10 millimeter. We have our wiring harness bundle held in by 1 Phillips head screw, and we can go ahead and reconnect everything. A couple retaining clips to help hold the wires out of the way. Then we have some ductwork, followed by our glove box trim. We have 3 Phillips head screws and 1 10 millimeter. And then 1 additional Phillips head screw on the bottom left with a little cover piece. Then we have our trim on the floor with that thumb screw. We have a panel underneath and our glove box. And this repair is now complete.